Internet to Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing The Confusion of Tongues Between Adults and Children by Sandor Ferenczi. So this is quite a short article, but very, very impactful. It has a whole history in psychoanalysis as being one of the more controversial texts, at least early on in psychoanalysis. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about the context. At the time when it was written by Ferenczi, Freud had distanced himself about the question of real traumatic experience to focus on the internal life of the individual, i.e. the fantasy. And for Freud, his Oedipus complex was only based in fantasy. There was nothing real or interactional about it. It was purely in the conscious and unconscious minds that it happened, but not in the external environment. With this text, Ferenczi is going to go against it. And not in any superficial way, but in a very profound way, as he's going to say that the impact of trauma cannot be underestimated if we are to understand neurosis, psychosis, and perversion, which was a very brave stance at the time, and one that was somewhat of a very risky move. But very good text and a very important stance, as this stance allowed other analysts to go further and beyond. And even though I don't think Fernbaum directly quotes Ferenczi, if you read both authors, you can clearly see that there is a lot of resemblance in their way of thinking. Now, let's go with the text. So Ferenczi opens up on a very interesting idea, that the question of trauma. So fundamentally, he says that trauma can be very vivid, very intense, that patients can be very aggressive towards the therapist, most notably on the question of the end of the sessions or certain interpretations. That aggression, he calls it hysteroid, is virtually a loss of reality at that moment, and such a massive reenactment of trauma that the patient just completely loses touch with both himself and reality. And he says that even though it's transitional in the fact that it goes out and the patient can regain stability, it's still very impressive. And he says that those moments happen also when therapists make mistakes, or doctors, because at the time everyone was a doctor, at least all therapists were doctors, virtually. Anyway, moving towards that, Ferenczi understands that psychoanalysts make mistakes, but he says that if you are to acknowledge those mistakes to the patient, that reinforces the alliance, the trust, the deeply rooted trust that the patient has towards the therapist is reinforced by the therapist acknowledging his mistakes, which, parentheses, is exceptionally true, very true and very important. I know that in ancient psychoanalysis there was this idea that the therapist should not even acknowledge any mistakes. But it is true that in terms of trauma, it's incredibly important, as the acknowledgement of the mistake is a way for the therapist to show in how different he is from the parent, the traumatic parent or the traumatic individual that has hurt the child, that they are willing to take responsibility for what has happened or not happened because of them. Secondly, and very importantly, it creates a safe environment in which the individual knows that he can trust the therapist, because the therapist is going to be honest and truthful, which the aggressor wasn't. So I went a little vite en besogne, you would say in French, as like I went a little too fast by saying parents, but it's because often in early childhood development, it's the environment, the direct environment, that can be the cause of trauma, but not always. So I don't want to say that parents are always responsible for mental disorders. I think it's a very dangerous route to go, and I just want to make it clear that it's not necessarily where I'm going, but because it's in this text also, that's why there was some kind of speedy conclusion, so to speak. So, coming back to the text, Ferenczi states that fundamentally, at the very core, those very intense reactions can be, in a way, decreased by acknowledging one's mistakes, by going beyond the professional hypocrisy, as he calls it in the text, of giving the appearance of not caring or giving this illusion that the doctor knows best. He says that once you cut off that, it makes things much better for the patient. And what he's going to say is that he's then going to speak about his theory, his main fundamental theory, that trauma comes from a fundamental conclusion. Yes, in a way it is a conclusion to which the adult is drawn to, but it's also fundamentally confusion. What happens is that when the aggressor is, as Ferenczi puts it, using substances or has lost touch with reality or himself has had perverse elements within his psyche, there is a confusional element in which he's going to mix up the will of the child to be loved, cared for a sexual demand. And that confusion is going to cause a moment of abuse within the aggressor towards the child. And the child does not want that love. And Ferenczi is very, very clear about that. That the conclusion the aggressor reaches is wrong. And the child does not want it. He even might internally protest against it, but is not strong enough, both physically, obviously, to overpower an adult, but also internally not strong enough, not built psychically to the maximum point in which he can internally reject what is happening. So the trauma is forced on the child, both physically and mentally. That forcefulness is going to create, unfortunately, an identification with the aggressor that the child is going to take in within himself or herself all the blame, all the guilt, all the hatred that the aggressor feels for himself at that moment, and they're going to internalize it. Meaning that, unfortunately, very unfortunately, what is happening in the real world is going to have an impact in the psyche. To put it in Fernbernian terms, what's going to happen at that very moment is that the endopsychic structure of fundamentally over-attachment and rejection is going to start forming itself and really crystallizing itself and gain, in a lot of sense, a lot of power within the mind. And that's what's happening. The child is going to introject the aggressor. The aggressor is unfortunately going to be a part of his psyche, a bad object in which he's not going to be able to fight alone, because it takes such a massive space and it destroys what was there before, i.e. normal construction. And for Ferenczi, when someone is having a hysteroid crisis, as he calls it, or the attachment of reality in a moment of trauma, what is happening is that there is this hope, fundamental at its core, to go before, to be able to regress before the impact of trauma, to go back to blissfulness of early infancy. In a way, the patient is trying to heal through that. And there's a lot of merit to that hypothesis. But the unfortunate thing is that if it's not in the right context, it will just end up repeating the trauma, not healing it. And that's something that he also points out in this article. Very fundamentally, this article is incredibly important, as it shows that the impact of trauma is real. It's not just a fantasy, a mind construct, as Freud, but that real events create real consequences on the mind, which it seems nowadays to be a foregone conclusion, but you have to remember at the time it wasn't. So there's another interesting fact that Ferenczi points out, is that once there is trauma, there is splitting within the ego, i.e. the identity of the individual is going to start breaking down in many parts that are not going to be reassembled easily. If you read Fernben, once again, it's going to ring a bell with anti-libidinal ego and libidinal ego. It's the same kind of essence we have here. And both authors have a fundamentally good understanding of trauma, which Ferenczi hits the nail on the head with this article. He also says that aggressors are often, after the deed is done, turn towards religion or morals or ethics to try and save the child from what has happened. Here, I personally disagree. I don't think the aggressor is trying to save anyone, be him the parent, the carer, the nurse, regardless of the position. I don't think the aggressor is trying to save anyone but himself. What is happening is that, I think that he's trying to instrumentalize the child, i.e., well, what I did was immoral, but I'm a very moral person. Here, I have those standards. So therefore, what you've experienced was right. And forcing the child to, in a way, to use modern language, being gaslighted into believing that the other person is moral, not them. Secondly, if they are trying to save someone, it's themselves, that split part of who they are. The aggressor is trying to, in a way, redeem himself from his action, but not trying to save the child. On this element, I fundamentally disagree with Ferenczi and his understanding of the situation. The aggressor is not trying that, and often it's even more tragic when the patient believes that the aggressor is trying to save them, as this is going to spark a whole hope that both can be saved, when one is clearly feeding on the other. And for Ferenczi, what's going to happen? One of the main fundamental effects of the trauma is going to be progression traumatique, as we would say in French, a progression that is traumatic, i.e. the child is going to become an adult, a mature human being, very quickly, too quickly. Ferenczi gives this image, which I think is very telling, of a fruit that becomes nice and sweet, but it's because it's been hurt and broken by a bird, pecked by a bird. So in a way, the fruit becomes good for us because it's adapted, but it's been bruised and hurt. And in the same way, the child is going to become adapted, good, parentified, as we would say nowadays, or even a mini adult, because he has to adapt because of the trauma. The trauma has forced him to quickly become an adult, quickly, in order to protect himself from further trauma. There's also a very real risk that what the child has experienced is going to internalize it, and unfortunately his sexuality is going to become perverse, that he's going to unfortunately repeat what he suffered through by thinking internally that he is like the aggressor, that in a way what the aggressor did was not wrong. And that internal logic is there because there was trauma. And statistically, it does verify itself as, trigger warning, pedophiles often have been themselves abused, at least in 80% of the cases, which is enormous. I also should point out that for Ferenczi, once we've understood that this trauma has a deep effect on the child, we can't go back to ignoring it. We can't go back to a pre-phase of it's just fantasy. And that's very important because that can change the way we raise children. And he was not wrong. Like, we're virtually 100 years later. And fundamentally, he isn't wrong at all. That our way of seeing childhood has completely been changed by those types of ideas. I'm not saying that Ferenczi himself did it, but this whole understanding helped us, I really feel, make people and give people happier childhoods on the whole, because people that are goodwill, parents that have a mature ego or have good relationships with their children, understand this and help the children develop. That doesn't mean there is not any problems, right? There are always problems, but I really think that children nowadays have, in a way, a more secure childhood than 100, 200, 300 years ago. And of course, there are a lot of still very horrible childhoods that people experience. I'm not saying that has gone, but I think that now we have at least a basis of understanding that it does matter. And that's thanks to those types of ideas that Ferenczi is pushing in this article. This article, in a way, for me, is a very important one, and one that has changed the game forever. But it's also an article in which I disagree on certain points, because I feel that, for example, in terms of the fact that the aggressor wants to save the child, I really don't believe that. And I really don't believe that it's a confusion of tongues, as Ferenczi put it in the beginning of his article at the title part. Because fundamentally, I don't think the adult is confused. Not really, not truly, except if he has psychotic elements. I think the adult knows full well when he aggresses the child what he's up to. And it's a ways of destroying the child as they were destroyed. So I have a more, perhaps, cynical point of view of the adult in this, rather than Ferenczi, that sees the adult as someone that's trying but failing at protecting the child. I see them more as perpetrators that are trying to break something and kill the child psychically. Which, feel free to have your own opinion on the text and on what I'm saying, but here lies a fundamental disagreement between him and me. But you also have to put it in the context that it was like 100 years ago. So also you have to forgive authors. They're not up to today's standards, but that's obvious. Anyway, that pretty much sums it up. Very important article, very good article, and opened up in a way, real trauma to psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis was able to go beyond that, but it was an important foot in the door, so to speak. So, I'll see you in the next one, and if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll see you